type of faith is actually a way to form beliefs about things without having evidence. That's the other type of faith, I would say. But belief in things when you lack evidence or logic to believe it, you believe it because of faith, and maybe it's because it makes you feel good, or I don't know. I'm actually really curious what Shandon thinks inspires his faith, or how he knows how to direct faith, or what to have faith to believe in without evidence. I'm very curious on Shandon's thought.
So, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cancel Podcast, where we aim to challenge one's thoughts by bringing unique, creative, and potentially divisive topics to the table for discussion. As always, it's your boy Darius, aka Jay Sarad, representing Legendary Media Group. Today, my guest host is going to be the co-host from the first season, Mr. Elliott Plouts, the Philosopher Scholar. And today we have two special guests with us. We have Mr. Shandon, as well as Mr. Mike. And so, yeah, today's topic of the day is going to be
faith versus logic. But Shandon, you're a professor of philosophy, right?
At the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. That's correct.
Excellent. And you're also a believer, if I can ask your religious background.
Yes, I am a confessing evangelical Christian.
Okay. And you even have a new book coming out that you just finished recently?
That is correct. I appreciate the plug there. It's it's dedicated more or less. It's intended for a Christian audience, and it's on the subject that we're familiar with in our circle of believers as spiritual warfare. It's something I didn't anticipate writing on, but it happened, and it should be due out by before the end of this year.
Awesome. Okay. And Mike, you have a philosophy bachelor's degree background, right? And you're a lawyer as well?
Yeah. I graduated from UNLV with my undergrad in philosophy, and then also from Boyd Law at UNLV with my JD. And I now practice personal injury, like car accidents, slip and falls, dog bites, things like that at Adam S. Kuttner and Associates. I've been there 3 years.
That's awesome. And you two have actually debated on a similar topic before.
Yeah. I actually, Shandon, didn't we meet though at a church? You were lecturing at or giving a presentation, and I wanted to go hear the arguments, I think, for God's existence. Isn't that where we met first?
I think that's probably right. At a college ministry group that I was helping to run at the time, I remember meeting you, and that debate you're referring to, my goodness, I think we've hit the 10-year anniversary on that or something like it. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, after I saw you giving that series, I just went because I wanted to see the theist side of the debate. I've been essentially a lifelong atheist and studied philosophy of religion quite a lot in my undergrad. And I really wanted to see what's the best counter arguments for what I believed, and Shandon absolutely was the best I'd ever seen in person. So I believe I invited you to debate me and Professor Ramsey, right? And you were with Jordan Fischel, I think. It was student professor teams debating, does God exist, correct?
That's correct.
And it was wonderful. We packed the SU theater, didn't we?
It was pleasing to see so many people interested in the subject turn out. Yes,
it was awesome. It was probably one of my favorite moments of college. Just seeing people standing in the hallways to hear us debate God. It was great being a passion of mine.
Yeah.
No, that's very cool. I watched the YouTube video. Even they had a recording that was posted. But this today's topic is a little bit similar. It's faith versus logic. And Mike, I think you've definitely, been one of the most outspoken atheists that I know of, and you've done a lot for the atheist community. But I guess to start off, I was going to say, what do you think faith is, and does it have a place in your life or in the life of atheists?
Wow. Okay. So you're asking the atheist what faith is. I thought I would define logic, but okay, I'll do my best. So, I mean, I've always thought that there's different kinds of faith, right? Like, you can have faith in someone. You can have faith in yourself to be able to accomplish something. Having that sort of faith is more like, I would think, confidence, you know, like I have faith in myself that I can, you know, get promoted at work or something, or accomplish this goal, you know, deadlift 500 pounds eventually. Like I have faith in myself, I'll be able to do it. That's like confidence in something. However, I think that the type of faith we're probably discussing today is not that type of faith. I assume the type of faith we're talking about today is, my favorite definition is Mark Twain's, is faith is believing something you know ain't so. So that type of faith is actually a way to form beliefs about things without having evidence. That's the other type of faith, I would say. But belief in things, when you lack evidence or logic to believe it, you believe it because of faith. And maybe it's because it makes you feel good, or I don't know. I'm actually really curious what Shandon thinks inspires his faith, or how he knows how to direct faith, or what to have faith to believe in without evidence. I'm very curious on Shandon's thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, I actually agree with your definition, your initial definition of faith as a sort of trust or confidence. And I'm not just speaking for, you know, myself, or offering some kind of ulterior, definition for faith. This one is actually rooted in, say, something like the Bible, where you have references in the New Testament, implicit as they are, because the Bible's not written as a sort of systematic theology. It's not it's not there to adjudicate difficult terms. And so it's not a math book, it's not a science book, it's not a theology book. It's a collection of stories and descriptions and histories and poetry and things of that sort. But implicit in the New Testament is that faith is, of course, something that is trusting in a person in proportion to what the evidence warrants. That would be a New Testament implied understanding. But then there are references to faith with the definite article, like pisteos, which means the faith. And that is typically understood to be the Christian proclamation itself, or the gospel, and then the community that upholds that particular confession. So you'll see parts in the New Testament where it says, hold firm to the faith, or something like that. So they're talking about the message. But faith, as it's used in the more conventional sense, the more familiar sense, is not the Mark Twainian sort of believing apart from evidence. There are no canonical definitions of faith of which I am aware, where faith is defined that way. But it's implied in the New Testament that faith is confidence or trust in a person. And we have further testament to the fact that evidence plays a significant role. Just, on the fly, we have passages like in the Old Testament, we have Isaiah 1:18, where Yahweh says, "Come, let us reason. Though your sins are red as scarlet, they will be white as snow." Or all throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus himself consistently says, if you don't believe me, at least believe the works that I do. And it's recognized even by skeptics like Nicodemus in John chapter 3, that no one can do the things that Jesus does unless God is with him. So it's the works that Jesus is doing is seen to be confirming evidences for the confession that Christ is giving. And all through the New Testament, I can go on and on, but I just want to agree with Mike's initial definition and not the latter.
Well, in that case, this may be a very short discussion, or just one where we agree, because if that's the definition, your definition of faith, then actually I don't think that's an interesting debate. Everyone, I think that use of the word faith as in confidence in a person based on evidence. Like for example, I can have faith in myself that I will one day like deadlift 500 pounds. Like I said, because I've seen myself progress steadily towards that goal. So there's evidence to believe, have faith, confidence in myself, I'll achieve that. Or, you know, you can have a faith in a friend that they're never going to lie to you because they never have, things like that. I don't think there, I mean, in that case, if that's your definition of faith, I have no disagreement with you, at least. And I don't know if there was supposed to be disagreement, but I definitely agree with you if that's your definition. That's a totally fine use of the word faith that I take no issue with.
So I have a question then. So for Shandon, in terms of like the abstract aspect of faith, like what are your thoughts on that? Like, are there any pros and cons on living like a more faith-driven approach to life over a more logistical one?
Okay, so this is cutting to the heart of sort of my misgiving of the podcast title, which is this insinuation that faith is in opposition to the system of logic. And as I have expressed the definition of faith, I would hope that it's clear that there's not friction between the two. Mike's having confidence in his deadlifting 500 pounds, or me having confidence in someone strapping a harness to me if I'm in a zip line, that wouldn't be contrary to logic. It would be predicated on it, because I would have some grounds for thinking that people who run zipline organizations tend to be reliable. There are safety protocols, legal issues they want to avoid. So I have a battery of evidences that tell me that I can believe a particular company that's going to have a ziplining industry and is going to strap a harness to me. So living by faith in God, say, is analogous, similar to, say, living with a fidelity in marriage. So you marry and you trust that your spouse is going to have faith in you. You vow to have faith in them. And it's that fidelity that, you know, you continue to live day by day. Now, can there be episodes or events that surface that reveal an infidelity on the part of your spouse? Of course. This is what we say in philosophy, is that faith can be defeasible, which is to say that you can have evidence that would undermine or undercut that faith in question.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. Oh, go ahead, Elliott.
No, that's interesting. It's just I think faith can and should be defeasible, and in that way, faith becomes more reliable, right? Because if there are things that we should increase or decrease our faith with, then it does adjust. But it seems like some believers have what I would say is like 100% faith. So they say, I believe in God 100%, and in a way that it is not defeasible. And that is often seen as a virtue.
Yes, faith as virtue. And that, I would argue, when people say that as faith is a virtue, I'm pretty sure that the faith in that phrase is the type of the Mark Twain type of faith, you know, where it's basically belief without evidence, you know, and they probably don't think of it in that sense, that they're believing something that they know ain't so, but faith is a virtue in the sense that it's a virtue to believe things without evidence. Some things, at least I think some believers would argue that. So maybe Shandon doesn't agree with that. You know, I'm actually curious if he does think that sort of faith is a virtue, to believe, say, in God no matter what, and it's non-negotiable. It's just you have faith in it and nothing will change that belief. And I think many believers, if you kind of put it to them that way, you ask them, what do you think of that? What do you think of just having faith in God without evidence? They would say, well, that's a virtue. But I'm curious if Shandon would agree with that, or what his view is on that type of faith, even if that's not his, I suppose, because it is for many, I would think.
Well, that's I don't think that statistic of many would be backed up. I think maybe anecdotally there are folks we may run into who will say, well, I just believe, or I cling to my faith, and it doesn't matter what the science or the evidence says or whatever. But I think most of the time, even in those circumstances, folks often confuse what it means to have support for the faith or an understanding of what that faith is grounded in. And I also want to say that this is not a binary issue either. This is not a matter of I either embrace faith in contradistinction to the evidence or I embrace faith based on the evidence. There are respectable epistemological positions within philosophy in general that seed a sort of view of belief that can be held apart from the evidence. One obvious one that nobody really contests would be what are identified as non-inferential beliefs or basic beliefs. Basic beliefs are not arrived at by evidence. If I have a conscious experience of having a headache, that's not based on evidence, it just is to me. That's sort of a foundationalist approach. And then there are more controversial claims about whether you're entitled to believe something apart from evidence, such as, is Michael Gobaud actually an embodied mind on another end of a camera who's talking with us, or is he, a piece of software, sophisticated VR software that's giving us the illusion that he's here with us today? And such epistemologists would say, I'm entitled to the belief that Mike is who he says he is. I'm being appeared to Mike Gobaudly, as it were. And so I can embrace that. But if you ask me to prove it, I probably couldn't do that. Now, I'm not siding with that position. I just want to mention that there's more of a complexion to epistemology than simply belief and the evidence be damned, or belief based on the evidence.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that actually.
Because there's evidence, and then you're saying, it's almost like there's two components, right? So here we have the evidence, and then here we have certain amounts of faith.
Yes, but I would say that they're interrelated, that our faith is in proportion to what the evidence warrants, just like it would be in another person. What's your faith in your relationship with a girlfriend or whomever will be in direct proportion to what you know about them and how they live their lives and how they carry themselves, and what they say and what they text and all of that.
Okay. So Shandon, I guess one question, like from your experience of being a man of faith and being religious, like from those that you've interacted with, like what would you say the general thoughts are on predestination versus like free will? Because I know in terms of having like a solid foundation in faith, there's generally, like I have some friends that I've had these conversations with, they're very pro predestination. So everything's already written. God has a plan. You're born, you go through life, you die. But a lot of other individuals that I've interacted with, like I'm kind of on the fence of both. They kind of believe that you act as you go and you kind of just live life as it is. And then from there, I kind of feel like there is some dissonance between like being solely faith-based versus taking a logical, more practical approach to life.
Well, let me preface this for the sake of the audience here in explaining briefly what a doctrine of predestination would be. According to typically the Reformation movement, a predestination is the idea that God unilaterally decides and causes what happens. And I sense, Jay, that you perhaps don't agree with that, and I would follow in that camp. I would disagree with that as a proper understanding of the sovereignty of God. But I wouldn't say that folk, just because they hold to a robust doctrine of predestination like that, that somehow they are irrational. From the ancient Greek fatalists who held extreme versions of something like that, all the way to a friend of mine who just put out a book a year or so ago, Guillaume Bignon, the French philosopher who just put out a book on defending this sort of Calvinist understanding. I think it's called Blaming God or something like that. And he gives a nice, robust philosophical defense of his position. And he's entitled to that view, but I don't think it's a matter of saying, oh, he just holds on to it by faith. Now, that having been said, typical conversations with Christians who confess predestination as such, they will typically say, when you ask them about complications of the doctrine, like how do you reconcile human decision-making in a world where God unilaterally makes us do everything that we do, this is a controversy known as compatibilism or incompatibilism, depending upon where you fall into, and you can have a debate or discussion about it, but the typical Calvinist might say, it's just a mystery to me. I can't reconcile it, so it's just a mystery. And I think that we're entitled to that as if there would be good reasons for the doctrine in the first place.
Huh. That's interesting, Shandon. I had never considered, philosophical compatibilism as it relates to free will when considering, I guess, Calvinism or this predestination from God. I've always understood compatibilism, at least in the philosophical discussion of free will, to be a response to the hard determinist, right? But that makes sense that you could use the exact same principle of compatibilism, which I got my degree a long time ago. I haven't been teaching it like you, so forgive me if I'm not quite as accurate in my definitions of philosophical terms these days. But if I remember correctly, compatibilism is the idea that even though we can accept determinism in the universe, the laws of physics and cause and effect, which essentially makes it so that any decision we make, we could not have done otherwise. We don't have contra-causal freedom, I believe it's called, which is the ability to have done something else. Well, once a decision or action is undertaken, that was the result of a string of occurrences that are all in a long chain of cause and effect that date back to essentially the beginning of time, the beginning of matter, or what have you. So essentially, the compatibilist, then says, even though we can accept that principle scientifically, that we do not have contra-causal freedom, perhaps that's not really, that doesn't really get rid of free will. Essentially, compatibilism is a way of redefining free will to mean, rather than the ability to have done otherwise, let's just define free will as the ability to do what you want. Almost the feeling itself of free will and being a free actor is what gives you free will. So essentially what you're saying is you can apply that same principle of compatibilism and kind of redefining free will if you consider, instead of the universe and the laws of physics creating a deterministic universe and our actions kind of being predetermined, you could say, okay, it's God, not the laws of physics, but God is predetermining the entire sequence of actions throughout the universe, throughout all time. And then you can use this sort of compatibilist principle to say, well, that doesn't mean we don't have free will. We still should try to do good and make good decisions, because the point is that we are doing ultimately what we want. I mean, I think it gets a little tricky if you're trying to then still say that, God can punish you for wrong action or wrong decision. I feel like it might fall short there, because that still doesn't seem fair then if you don't have that contra-causal freedom. It's like, yeah, you kind of felt like you were doing what you want, but you really couldn't have done otherwise, and now you go to hell for example, or for doing having the wrong decision or the wrong belief. That doesn't quite seem to satisfy that issue to me, in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with your sentiment there. And so more sophisticated Calvinists will identify their position as theological determinism, precisely because it is essentially the same thing as a sort of non-supernaturalist version of determinism. The antecedent causes wouldn't be plurality in various physical laws and constants and so forth. It would be in God, who directs and controls everything down to the molecule, insofar as unilaterally only giving one history of the universe, as it were. And so only one set of events is going to obtain, precisely because God makes it that way. And I agree with it. I think it has problems with culpability and so forth, which is why Bignon, whom I cited a moment ago, entitles his book Blaming God, because that's precisely one of the number one charges against this Calvinist construct, is that God makes a sin, so to speak, and then we're responsible for it, which is profoundly, unacceptable. But the defense they offer, to their credit, is far more sophisticated. But nevertheless, that you have captured accurately the spirit. So whether it's been a while since you've dabbled in philosophy, you seem to have a pretty good handle on it here.
Well, thanks. Glad I remember a few things I learned back then.
No, that was great. But to bring it back a little bit to faith and logic, one thing that we were talking about, like Mike, it seemed like you were trying to say, well, if we have faith in this and it leads to this conclusion logically, and we don't think that conclusion is fair or makes sense, then are you saying like we should adjust the faith? So that's kind of what I'm curious about. We can have evidence, then we can have faith, and with those combination, it leads us to new beliefs, but those new beliefs might be contradictory. And if that's the case, do we adjust the evidence or do we adjust the faith? Like, what would that be?
You asking me?
This is really for you both, but I guess I would ask Shandon too.
Well, offering the possibility of adjusting the evidence sounds a bit nefarious, in the sense that, are we going to involve ourselves in confirmation bias or something like that? Are we going to fix the evidence so we only pay attention to what we like and start sifting out what we don't like? I do think that faith is in gradations. I don't want to give the misimpression of the binariness of faith. I think faith is to be understood, for lack of better words, inductively. And so just as an inductive argument can grow in strength or be depleted of its strength, depending upon new evidence that may come into the fray, faith could be proportioned likewise. And you see this in the New Testament. You have people who just have an unfettering faith, and like Peter, for example, but then you also have a John the Baptist who sends a couple of people to Jesus to ask the question, hey, are you even the Messiah? We don't even know anymore. Or the man that comes to Jesus and says, and a healing takes place. And then he says, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief, help me. So I think there's a recognition that faith comes in gradations. And so, which is why I defined it as that which is in proportion to the evidence.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that. And like also too, so would you say like that is a more common approach within like the faith-based community? Like maybe it's just not as publicized as you would say?
Well, probably few people think philosophically deep with some depth about this issue. I think the average person may say something along the lines of, I believe because God is a reality to me, which is a very, very unsophisticated version of what Alvin Plantinga identifies as a properly basic belief. That I had breakfast this morning, for example. I can't demonstrate that happened to me, but somebody would say, but I have what I believe, I have this memory, I have the experience, or so I think I did. I've been appeared to eating breakfastly, such a thing. And though I can't prove it, no one can disprove it, I'm entitled to that experience. And so that's a respectable position to hold that is not tethered to religion or not. You have, again, a philosophical camp, typically in what's called externalism, which will hold that you could have reliable beliefs that are made reliable for conditions within your circumstances and proper function of who you are, belief-forming faculties and so forth. If you have every reason to think that your belief-forming faculties are functioning properly, then when one of the beliefs that's coughed up is belief in God, why should I think suddenly that one's unreliable? So that's a sophisticated way to accommodate someone who says, I just believe on faith. And there have been people historically which have decried evidence. They're just far and few between. You have someone like Parham Hare or Karl Barth, the great theologian, back to, I think it was Cicero or Seneca that said, I believe because it's absurd. But to what extent they really mean, hey, I'm embracing my faith precisely because it's idiotic or ridiculous or refuted by the evidence. I don't think they would say that. I don't know of anyone that would say that.
Well,
right. Well, yeah.
Shannon, are you talking about, theologians and philosophers, theist philosophers of religion? Because I honestly don't think that the average believer could cite evidence or arguments for why they believe in God. Clearly, you believe you have evidence. I've heard it. I've heard a lot about what you see as evidence for the belief in God. So, and I'm sure that most, theist philosophers and believers who study the rationality of belief, yeah, they have evidence. They're not proponents of believing without evidence, that type of faith. But I mean, you probably know more believers than I do, but I have known many believers in my time. And I feel like a lot of them, when I ask them, why do you believe in God? It comes down to, I just have faith. Maybe that's just my experience, or maybe a skewed sample. I'm really curious though, if you genuinely feel that if you ask the average believer on the street randomly, a random theist, why do you believe in God? Are they going to say, oh, well, because of this argument and this argument and this argument and this evidence and this logic? Or are they going to say, I have faith and not really have arguments or evidence? What do you really think, Shandon?
Well, I'm not saying that those encounters aren't real where folks will say, I just believe. And I acknowledged that early on in this episode. What I'm doing is I'm suggesting that if you were to probe deeper, I suspect their response would be a matter of not being sophisticated enough to frame how they came to believe, their grounding or their foundation, as it were. For example, if somebody said, you ask them, why do you believe in God and why do you believe in Christianity? Oh, I just do. I just believe. And if you walk away at that moment, you might get that impression. But if you press further, they might follow that up with something, again, unsophisticated, but on point, which would be, well, nature is very interesting and beautiful. And I just don't think that would be a cosmic accident. And so it seems to scream God to me, So they might give an unsophisticated but reasonable response. Others might say even something that sounds bad. They might say something like, I only believe really because that's what my parents believe. But if you think about it, they're adopting a form of reliable testimony, as it were. They're assuming what their parents say is generally reliable, and they're inferring this particular claim to be amidst all the other claims that are momentous. And since they've been right all along, they're inductively likely to be right here. Again, you don't have to like the argument. It doesn't have to be good. But I think a lot of people at the end of the day are more willing to ground it in something rather than just literally say, you know, I know the evidence is completely against my beliefs, but nevertheless, I hold it. In fact, I think if you framed your question that way, you'd get a much different response.
I don't think many believers would say, I know the evidence is against it, but I choose to believe. But you know, what I'm saying is that they're either, at least in my experience, for the most part, going to say, you know, I believe because I'll give you some of the answers that I've heard, you know. I believe because I don't like the idea that nothing happens after I die, or I want to see my loved ones again in the afterlife, or there has to be some form of cosmic justice for all the suffering in the world. Essentially, they have pragmatic or emotional reasons for believing. And now if you're going to go ahead and say that, well, you know, even if they have a reason such as, well, you know, it's because my parents taught me it and generally things they taught me were true. If you're going to count that in the side of believers with evidence, I'm gonna say that's not fair, because that is not evidence of any sort. That's not an argument of any sort. That's actually really faulty reasoning. That is no better of an answer than I believe because it makes me feel good. It's no better. It's different. It's different, but certainly not better. They both completely lack any sort of logic, reasoning, or evidence. It's essentially just the same as saying, I have faith.
Yeah, all forms of sort of wishful thinking constructs aren't evidence at all. You can't say the God hypothesis is more probable given that I really, really hope that I have eternal life. Obviously, nobody thinks that that's a reasonable position. I think when folks will say something like that, to their credit, being charitable here, is they're taking a sort of Pascalian approach, sort of a Blaise Pascal approach, this implied understanding that the evidence doesn't really point either way, but I have to make a decision because no decision is a decision. Kind of like standing on the railroad tracks and you're unaware of whether there's an oncoming train. So the question is, do you move? And if you may have no evidence one way or the other, supposedly, in which case you might say the risk of staying outweighs any reward. And so a risk reward calculation drives you to get out of the way. And if someone is thinking along those lines, like, I don't know, the evidence could go either way. Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. But because I really, really want to be on the right side, you know, I don't want to give up eternity, then as William James said, I'm going to engage in the will to believe, precisely because this is a significant decision to make. So it's an existential argument. Is it a good one? Not by itself, but I think it's rational if the evidence in fact is 50-50 or difficult to adjudicate.
Yeah, but in reality, considering the, you know, vast numbers of religions, all of which, or almost all of which, you know, say that if you don't believe in that one true God, you get hit by the train, you go to hell. It's really not a matter of whether to stay on the train tracks or get off. It's a matter of, you know, stepping off of these train tracks and onto another one. And it's all tracks. It's all tracks. You know what I mean? So I cannot believe that these absolutely, you know, illogical, baseless arguments or reasons count as evidence. That they don't. It really just comes down to faith. If your argument is some sort of, you know, Pascal's wager type argument that is so erroneous that I don't count that as anything but faith.
Well, again, that's more generic. Pascal's not framing it in terms of world religions and interpretations of God. He's framing it in terms of God or no God. And so it's construed in a binary fashion. I think when it comes to taking into account the numerous interpretations of God, that is a different matter altogether. And I'm not defending that is reason, or that is a good argument for being a Christian. All I'm saying is that's not the same thing as saying I believe and to heck with the evidence. That's not the same thing. If someone has a Pascalian kind of argument and you want to point out the flaws of that approach vis-a-vis world religions or whatever, then what you're doing is you're showing their argument to be defective, not that there's no argument. But the threshold here is very small. We're just wondering, is their faith just ridiculous and had without any consideration of reason? And I think we have to say that even a Pascalian person is attempting some matter of reason they find convincing, flawed or not.
I'll grant that. It's better than saying I believe because it makes me happy. Fair. If someone were to present a Pascalian argument, you're right. You can consider it some form of reasoning, which is better than none. You know, obviously, I mean, here's the thing. I know there are arguments for believing in God. I know there have been attempts to make belief in God logical and reasonable. Of course, I'm aware of those. I think they all fail. So that's the thing. I would still rather, you know, have a believer who at least knows the arguments. At least, you know, they think that they have evidence and that those you know, arguments are sound and, you know, justify a reasonable belief in a creator. I would rather have that. So fair enough. I'll grant that. I guess I shouldn't just dismiss, you know, some sort of weak Pascalian reasoning, because if I do that, then I'm basically dismissing all reasoning for believing in God, which of course I do personally. But I'll grant that I'd rather have that type of person. I think that type of person is essentially at least thinking about it more deeply and thoughtfully. So it's better. It's a better form of believer in my mind.
And it's up.
Yeah, and I can make. Oh yeah, go ahead, Sean.
I'm sorry, Jay. Go ahead. I was just going to say, I do think, Mike, that it's up to you and I to continue to expand this kind of conversation to get people more involved. I do think that, because I hold a different position. I think the more that people explore the evidences for the existence of God, as is demonstrably the case amongst graduate students and professors of philosophy, where within the last 50 years, there's been exponential growth in belief in God in the most sophisticated quarters of the humanities. And I'm confident that if we could expand and distill those conversations for average people, that we'll see a stronger influx of people who will side with theism. I'm all in favor of informing and delving into the arguments pro and con.
But it is still the case that among academic disciplines, the highest percentage of atheists are generally found among philosophers. At least last I checked, that was the case. Is that not true anymore, Shandon? You might know more recent data than I do, but that was. I
haven't compared the disciplines, but the last time I checked, the Chalmers study from Phil Papers, which I think is dated in 2000, shows about 25% of graduate students and professors rank as committed theists. But we're to see that as a rate of growth, because just a couple of decades prior to that, it was something like 1 or 2%. So that's
right.
Pretty substantial.
That's the percentage I'm familiar with, is the 1 or 2% are theists in academic philosophy. I'm familiar with that paper. I love that study. That's interesting. I did not recall it saying 25% are theists. Now I feel like that's one of the numbers I would have remembered. Man, we have the internet though, and we can actually easily. I'm super curious to see if that's accurate, because I feel like
you could. I think you have to add up those numbers, and but they're available. So
yeah, while Mike pulls that up too. While Mike pulls that up, I know. The reason why we came up with this topic as well is, like, me and Elliott, we actually had a conversation that was kind of similar for STEM fields. they were saying the higher up that you go in STEM, the more people tend to lean more atheist. Like they want that more, that physical evidence. They want to have that backing for the research. And that's what kind of, led to this topic that we had. Because I know Elliott is more atheist. Agnostic. I don't follow organized religion, but I'm kind of like mixed with my beliefs. And the hardest part is we'll never be able to confirm the beginning. It was Big Bang Theory. It was God. Like, we all have our own approaches to it, but we were never physically there in that moment to kind of prove it. Like science has its it has its own theories, and it can go only so far. And I think that's what kind of brought up this interesting conversation to kind of see where people's mindsets are. Like, how do you get to that beginning point, and how do you accurately claim it with evidence? Because even though you, like, as a man of faith, you do believe in evidence-backed beliefs, it's like it becomes harder and harder to kind of bring those forward to the table on both ends, not just on the faith end, but even on the scientific, logical end as well.
So I found the study results, and Shandon, I believe you lumped in the theism with other, which doesn't seem fair. When they were asked God, theism or atheism, accept or lean toward atheism was 678 out of 931, or 72.8%. And then accept or lean towards theism was only 136 out of 931, which is 14.6%. Other was 117 out of 931, 12.6. So are you adding other with theism to get the 20? I guess that would then be 27%, but I could just add other to atheism. How do you see that as fair?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do that. You're calling me on something I haven't looked at probably in the better part of a decade. All I know is that we want to count the graduate students and the professors, and the salient point here is the rate of growth, which is more substantial than it was. But I can't sit here and adjudicate the study blind. That would be blind faith, and I wouldn't want to do that.
Fair enough. I was just shocked at that, because 25%, a quarter, I would have remembered that number, I feel like. And when I saw the results, I didn't feel like I was that surprised. Although you make the point that it does seem to be bigger than I recall when I had looked into that number previously. I do remember it being like 1 or 2%, but that seems like quite a lot of growth in only a couple decades, which would make me really want to look at the samples of those two studies and to see if there's any other explanation for that rate of growth, because that is fair enough. That is interesting. Obviously, it's still as one of the bigger minorities in the study. There weren't a lot of things that were 72% confidence. So even if you say that, actually, it just from a brief glance, it looks like there was no other position. Oh, except for external world idealism, skepticism, or non-skeptical realism had 81% believers in non-skeptical realism. But just about everything else, there wasn't anything that was so philosophers were so confident in as atheism. So fair, you may look at it, on the one hand as this is quite a lot of growth, or you can look at it on the other, which is that philosophers are pretty confident in this idea of atheism, at least the ones who study it.
So, Mike, I do have one challenge there. So, would it be safe to argue that the other could be included with theism? Because isn't atheism much more absolute? Where it's like, if you do believe a little bit, would that be technically closer to theism?
That's an interesting question. So you're saying is atheism more of an absolute position, and therefore if you select other, you're more rejecting atheism than you are rejecting theism. Is that what you're saying?
Potentially. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because like, even if you have a little bit of faith, like let's use an analogy of a vegan meal, right?
Mm-hmm.
If 99% of the products are vegan, but you decide to put some milk and eggs in it, just a small amount, it would no longer be vegan, right? Like vegan would have to be like an absolute all plant-based dish. So with atheism, if I were to use that same analogy, would that be a similar understanding, or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. I'm gonna say that I would define other more as undecided. So you know, you call it agnostic perhaps, but essentially I don't think there's any reason to say that, you know, you can lump the others with theism any more than you can lump them with atheism, because, you know, I mean, because I'll explain why. Because I think that theism is also an absolute position. You can't believe that I'm in the state of Nevada and not, or at the same time, or kind of believe I'm in the state of Nevada right now. You could say that theism is like that, or you know, I can't kind of believe that you know, Joe Biden is a person alive right now, and at the same time kind of not. So I mean, if you think about God the same way, either you believe God exists or not, and anything that is other than an affirmative belief in the existence of that entity, just like with, you know, Joe Biden, you could say is actually disbelief. So no, I don't buy the adding that to the other to the theist. But I see what you're saying there. It's a good question though.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Shandon, as well? Because Mike, that's a very good point too, to kind of say it's more of a spectrum on both aspects. I do like that. I
think there's something to be said about how people would identify as an atheist proper, because I think it was Antony Flew that once defined atheism as a presumption. That is, it's kind of a default position. It's just a state of non-belief. And if that's your broad-based definition, you're liable to have more, you're liable to include agnostics in that. So if we're saying truly that the other is a category that shouldn't be included either way, I think there's a lot more other that might be in the atheist category and should be in the other category. And so there's that possibility. But I don't want to sit here and surgically tear apart this study, which is taking us far afield. I just wanted to note that, yeah, when it comes to defining what an atheist is, you do have folks in different parts of the spectrum, albeit what they call a strong atheist or a weak atheist or what have you. But a lot of agnostic positions sometimes are identified with atheism, which I think is a technical mistake, but it's not anything we have to solve here.
That's interesting. I would say the opposite. I would say the opposite, that I think a lot of people who define themselves or are defined as agnostic actually should be counted as atheists. So it's almost, and you know, I hear you that you feel like we might be derailed a bit, but I don't actually think it is derailing at all. I think this is in line with kind of the overall theme of the discussion. I think it's an interesting point, right? So, you know, a lot of people, I think they say they're agnostic because they don't know, or they're undecided. So you could say that a lot of those others might be the undecided agnostics, right? People who would call themselves agnostic. I think actually there's much more reason to count them as atheists, because, you know, if you don't have a positive belief in something, then I would say you lack the belief. So for example, you know, if I were to say, you know, do I have a belief in schmunicorns? You know, if I don't really know what that even is, or have any evidence for that thing, and I'm like, oh, I'm agnostic, I don't really know what those are, I don't know if they exist, and then just proclaim agnosticism, and that would actually be faulty use of language. I would actually say, no, I'm an schmunicornist. I don't have a positive that thing. I can't have a positive belief that thing exists because I don't even know what they are. I've never even heard that word before. So I would actually think there's, good reason to think that people who kind of are on the fence, agnostic types, and they're just what I call closet atheists. They don't like using the A word because atheists are one of the most discriminated minorities in the world by far, hands down. So they just hate that label.
Okay.
No,
what are you? Oh yeah, go ahead, Jen.
I would say I would profoundly disagree with the concept of atheism as such. You can't define it as a mere lack of belief. That's not an atheist. A tree lacks beliefs, but it's not an atheist. The absence of belief, I'll give you an example. I currently don't have any good reason maybe to think that President Joe Biden is in Camp David right now. So I lack the belief he's at Camp David, but that doesn't therefore mean I affirm he's not at Camp David. I just don't know. Lacking a belief is not a position. It's the suspension of a position.
Well, the Oxford Dictionary defines atheism as a person who disbelieves or lacks belief in the existence of God or gods. So I actually think both would count as atheists. A person who disbelieves, I think you would probably call that a strong atheist or a positive atheist, maybe, Shandon. But a person who simply lacks the belief is an atheist. And no, a tree is not an atheist, although it lacks the belief. Only people who can hold beliefs would be atheists, could be an atheist, So yeah, I would actually think both those types of people would count as atheists. People who think there's evidence against the existence of God, and those who just don't think there's any evidence for the existence of God, both at least by the dictionary definition, which I'm going to go with, are atheists.
Well, okay. I will side with the canons of philosophy. That includes Paul Edwards' philosophy of, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I go with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I go with the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, and confessing professional philosophers themselves who are atheists, like William Rowe, who definitively define and address atheism as the belief there is no God or gods. Now, that having been said, you could replace the tree with an adult who's been raised on a deserted island and has had not access to anything. That person would not be an atheist because they lack belief. They haven't had access to anything that would lead them or tilt them one way or the other. Just lacking the property of a belief does not make one a denier of the object of that belief.
I don't think be a denier. I guess we might just come to an impasse on this. I just don't believe you have to be a denier to be counted as an atheist. I think all babies are atheists, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that's really weird. But regardless of that, yeah, because my dog would be an atheist too. The fact of the matter is I think we're acknowledging that there's ambiguity on the definition. I think we can come that far. And because of that gets back to my hesitation, siding with a little bit with Jay about to what extent an atheist is an atheist, as we understand it.
Yeah, I could agree with that. Elliott, what are your thoughts?
Well, no, this is an interesting thing, and I've definitely seen both sides, because I agree with Shandon that sometimes the theological response is like, well, merely lacking belief is not enough, because a rock would be an atheist. And I agree, dogs would be an atheist. And seeing the other side, though, I think that it's probably important that the question itself be asked. So you have to have the question in mind, if a God exists. And in some ways, you almost have to understand an idea of God to be able to answer the question and rightly be a theist or an atheist. Yeah. But
so that kind of coincides with the person on an island a little bit. That's what you're kind of saying.
Yeah, I do think that's important. And, that's like a quick thought experiment. But I also want to say we're coming to a close here. I wanted to thank you both so much for your time. We definitely talked about a lot. But I want to leave some space if there's any final comments, any other questions you'd like to ask.
And if not, I have one final question, but yeah, go ahead, Mike and Shannon.
Huh? You want us to ask questions? I thought you were going to ask final.
Oh no, I was saying if you have any final thoughts, if not, I can go with the one question I had, but would that be okay?
Sure. I'm down for a last question.
Okay. And Elliott, was there anything else that you wanted to cover too? Because I can give you the time if you want it.
No, that should be fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So my question, and I think this is in my opinion, might be a little bit harder. So what is your definition of the spirit? So what I've heard before is it's something that it's given to us from a higher power to give us that want to live and do the right by one another. And I also have heard that it's contained within the mind to reinforce the need for processing and decision making to live life. So what are either of your thoughts on that, on either of those definitions too?
Well, let me see if I can't understand the question first. You're asking for a definition of spirit. Can you give me a sentence so that I have a context in which you might mean that?
Okay. So do you feel that the spirit is inherent to us, like it was given to us by some sort of higher being? Or is
Are you talking about the Holy Spirit or a spirit of a human, or what are you?
I'll say of a human. To? Yeah, I'll say of a human.
Like
so
soul?
Soul? Yeah, like a soul. Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Sorry about that.
You're asking me to explain what that might be. Okay.
Yeah.
Christians are divided over this question, but I would say traditionally, and it's a view that I hold, is that the soul or the spirit is the order of mind. It's the seat of consciousness, and it is to be construed as being distinct, but not unrelated to the body that houses it. The spirit itself is immaterial, does not succumb to the laws of physics or anything of that sort, but it is definitely nomologically related to the body or brain that it inhabits, just much like as Karl Popper once said, it's like a pianist who's playing the piano. So imagine the piano is like the body and the pianist is the mind or the soul. It would be that kind of interrelation. So hopefully that gets some traction there as far as understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Well, as an atheist and a materialist, I don't believe in any immaterial soul or mind. I think that what people commonly, such as Shandon, consider the soul or the mind, the seat of consciousness, I think that it's an illusion. It just is the brain. And there's plenty of reason to think that whatever conception we have of an immaterial mind or soul is simply the brain. I mean, we know a lot about the brain at this point. We know that essentially the brain acts like a computer. We are pretty we know that if we damage certain parts of the brain, it directly affects certain parts of the mind. So I think that in years to come, I think that with the increase in our understanding of the brain, of neuroscience, I think this concept of an immaterial mind or soul will kind of disappear. We'll just understand that consciousness is just the brain. It's essentially an illusion. So I don't believe there is any immaterial soul.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Elliott. What are you about to say?
No, it's I think interesting points, and I would also point out something similar. My perspective on spirit and soul, which when you're a materialist, you're like, okay, just get rid of it, we'll be fine. But I do think that there's something like an emergent phenomenon occurring in a living being, so like in a living human, that there is a spirit that comes about. And it's similar, if you look up emergent phenomenon, you'll get a sense for it, but it's similar to how a single molecule of water isn't wet, and it isn't ice, and it's also not a gas per se, but it's when it's when it's surrounded by other molecules of water in similar states, then they exhibit these properties like wetness. Wetness is not any one water molecule. And so the spirit is not any one part. It's just the collection and the relationships between them that emerges from our bodies and minds.
I really like that definition.
Thanks.
Wow. Yeah, so that's why I wanted to kind of save that one for last, just because I feel like we would also be able to add our own creativity by our own personal beliefs on what the definition of a spirit or soul is. So yeah, I think that was actually really good. Elliott, did you want to lead us out?
Gosh, what are we saying? Well,
you don't have to do the official one.
Thanks again for being here. And it was so great to have you, but we'll be posting this video up soon. And let's see, this is the Canceled Podcast. So what do you all think? Should it be faith or logic that gets canceled? You decide.
I like it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you, Shandon. Great chatting with you again.
Yes, it's very, very mutual. Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure, gentlemen.
Yeah, we're honored to have the 10-year reunion brought back. So thank you both.
Yeah.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Just got off my block, just got on my chill. Called on my homie Brent to see what be the deal. What you trying to do? I'm just trying to heal. Hella floated, never bloated's what I'm trying to feel. Hop in the whip and